A ghostly nurse apparition appears at the surgical site, except for a small intern. No one else can see this phenomenon. The ghost nurse slowly approaches the operating table. She deliberately knocks over a scalpel nearby. The blade instantly cuts the back of the doctor's hand. The patient whose abdomen was open suddenly sits up. The frightened intern covers the patient's belly and quickly shoved the organs back into the patient's abdomen. However, the strange occurrences at the hospital keep increasing. Doctors and patients are repeatedly falling victim to foul play. Can the intern uncover the truth behind the ghost nurse's harm? In Mexico, 1979, a woman named Rebecca was preparing for a nursing job interview. The hospital urgently needed night shift staff. Because the shifts were 12 hours long, few were willing to stay. The head nurse had reviewed Rebecca's file. Her education and experience were both satisfactory. There was just one puzzling detail, that was, Rebecca hadn't worked for 4 years. The head nurse expressed curiosity about this. Rebecca explained that she had been taking care of her father during those years. However, the old man had now passed away. That's why Rebecca was returning to the workforce. The head nurse was satisfied with her answer. She even pointed to Rebecca's necklace and said, "The figure on the pendant is Saint Agatha, the patron saint of nurses and one of the earliest feminists." The head nurse felt there was no need for further questions, and immediately kept Rebecca. She told her to come in for work that night. After a month of internship, she could become a permanent staff member. Rebecca immediately agreed upon hearing this. This hospital had a long history. It had undergone many reconstructions, and witnessed countless revolutions and earthquakes. It had seen generations of medical staff dedicate countless days and nights to this work. After listening to the head nurse's introduction, Rebecca went to the changing room to put away her luggage. She had a mild case of obsessive-compulsive disorder and cleanliness. This was evident when she placed a handkerchief on the chair before the interview, and she could only touch the front half of someone's palm when shaking hands. After arranging her belongings, she meticulously ironed her white coat. Unexpectedly, she ran into two colleagues from the night shift. These two had a sexy and bold fashion style. One was named Paula and the other Lucy. They had strong and bold personalities. They mocked Rebecca for needing to change clothes under a blanket. This made the changing room atmosphere feel like a high school for girls. Paula, with her thick eyebrows, reminded Rebecca to remember 4 rules for the night shift. First, don't forget anything. Second, don't get distracted while working. Third, don't get involved with the staff. Fourth, no sleeping. Just as she finished speaking, the head nurse came over. She handed Rebecca the keys to the intensive care unit, and added that due to a recent theft incident, the intensive care unit was temporarily off limits. It contained some potent medications that required extra caution. After Rebecca changed and left, Paula asked the head nurse, "You haven't told her that people often end up dead from being accidentally burned in the intensive care unit, have you?" It seemed this hospital wasn't so simple. At this moment, Rebecca stood in front of the intensive care unit, devoutly making the sign of the cross. Then she took a deep breath and walked through the door. She systematically helped patients clean their wounds, distribute medications, and sterilize syringes. In the blink of an eye, several hours had passed. Just as Rebecca was about to give an injection to a patient, she suddenly heard a faint singing. She was startled. Cautiously, she walked out to investigate, but the hallway was empty, with no one in sight. Yet the singing didn't stop. Rebecca secretly urged herself to pretend she hadn't heard and continued to work. However, in her nervousness, she knocked over the iodine. The white nurse's uniform was stained. As Rebecca was about to change her clothes, she noticed that the cabinet door had been opened. Then, the sound of shoes hitting the floor echoed down the hallway. A shadow approached the glass window. Rebecca tentatively greeted the figure, but the person outside didn't respond. She ran out to the hallway to check. However, she couldn't see even half of a figure. Rebecca was completely panicked now. She hurried back to change her nurse uniform, but that annoying sound of shoes echoed again. Rebecca peeked over the cabinet. Sure enough, she saw that figure again. The figure wore a nurse's cap and moved strangely, bouncing forward like a zombie. The shadow was about to jump into the changing room. The empty hallway was filled only with the crisp sound of footsteps. Rebecca forced herself not to think about it. She quickly returned to check on the patients. Earlier, an old man had reported his pain level as a 6. He wanted Rebecca to give him a painkiller. However, only a few hours had passed. Surprisingly, the old man's pain level had dropped to around 2.
Me puso algo mientras dormía. Creí haberte visto entre sueños.
The old man took a closer look and denied his earlier statement. He said that the nurse in his dream was someone else. That person seemed to be wearing a black cloak over the nurse's uniform. Upon hearing this, Rebecca glanced at the records. She noticed there was another person's handwriting on it. Moreover, the painkiller tramadol on the tray had also been moved. Rebecca felt that someone was playing a prank on her. She rushed to the general patient area angrily, and questioned Lucy if she had given tramadol to her patient. After all, There were only 3 people on night shift in the building. The prankster had to be either Lucy or Paula. Lucy told Rebecca not to be paranoid. The keys to the intensive care unit are only with you and the doctor. How could we get in? Or did you forget to lock the door? Rebecca gradually calmed down upon hearing this. But if it wasn't Lucy or Paula, who was the eerie shadow and the strange singing? Just then, the lights behind Rebecca suddenly flickered wildly. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed again. A familiar shadow was reflected in the hallway. Before Rebecca could step forward to confirm, the alarm in the intensive care unit went off. Worried that something had happened to the patient, she hurried back to check. Rebecca called out loudly for the doctor, but there was no response. She had to check the patient herself. The patient's heart rate was rapid, blood pressure had dropped, and breathing was difficult. There was severe pain on the side and back. Rebecca recognized this as symptoms of a collapsed lung with fluid accumulation. She immediately turned the patient over to create an opening in the back. Then she connected a tube to drain the fluid. At this moment, the doctor suddenly appeared. He accused Rebecca of meddling. A nurse's job is to clean up vomit and bodily waste. After the doctor finished speaking, he stepped forward to check the patient's condition, and discovered that Rebecca had performed a tracheostomy. This was well beyond the scope of a nurse's duties. Rebecca explained that her father was an internist. She acted impulsively because the situation was urgent. The doctor stated that the incision she made was too large. After completing a thorough examination of the patient, I will determine whether your impulsiveness caused more harm than help. Having said that, he prepared to leave. Rebecca hurried to catch up with him and asked, "Is your initials EE? Someone just gave the patient a painkiller and left this signature in the notebook." The doctor's name is Carlos Sanchez. Dr. Carlos didn't take the matter seriously. He told Rebecca to take care of her own responsibilities. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, 2 weeks had passed. This day, Rebecca clocked in for work as usual, and ran into a woman named Nana. It seemed that the two had known each other for several years. Moreover, Nana called Rebecca Maria.
Ahora soy Rebeca. No quiero que nadie me reconozca.
Nana assumed that Rebecca had some unspoken difficulties. She promised to help Rebecca keep her real name a secret. Just then, Dr. Carlos walked toward the intensive care unit. Rebecca hurried over to open the door. It turned out that a new patient named Sang-Jin had arrived that morning. He required surgery to replace the aortic valve. This surgery was very important to Carlos, because there had only been one successful case in Mexico. Carlos instructed Rebecca to change clothes and assist with the surgery. Rebecca quickly explained that she was still an intern. Carlos pointed to the nearby doctor, saying that Samu had highly recommended her, stating that she had a rich background and was very capable. Rebecca felt very happy upon hearing this. Dr. Samu also brought Lucy in to temporarily take over all responsibilities in the intensive care unit and geriatrics area for Rebecca. Although Lucy was displeased, she had no choice but to agree. As Rebecca went to change, she saw a young nurse at the front desk yawning continuously from her attire. It seemed she was a temp worker. Unable to resist, Rebecca approached her to remind her not to sleep. "I'm doing this for your own good," she said. Then, Rebecca followed Samu into the operating room. He enthusiastically introduced her to various instruments. Although this was a thoughtful gesture, Samu was completely flirting with Rebecca in a playful manner. To be honest, Rebecca recognized all these instruments. However, she was happy to enjoy Samu's attentiveness. The surgery quickly began. As they reached the most critical step, Carlos became very nervous. At this moment, Rebecca heard the humming again. Soon after, the patient's blood pressure began to drop. Carlos and Samu quickly searched for the tear. They had to stop the bleeding immediately to save the patient's life. But the more busy Samu got, the more chaotic it became. As the patient's blood pressure dropped to the brink of shock, Carlos urgently ordered Rebecca to inject the patient with a large dose of atropine. However, when Rebecca turned around, she unexpectedly saw the nurse in the black cloak. She froze in place. However, the others couldn't see the eerie black nurse. Rebecca was stunned with fear. Carlos quickly snatched the syringe from her. Rebecca saw the nurse approach the operating table. She pointed at the patient with her pale finger. Then she intentionally knocked the scalpel, cutting Samu's hand. In the next second, the patient whose abdomen was open suddenly sat up straight. The internal organs rushed out in a chaotic manner. The patient let out a painful cry. Doctors and nurses frantically tried to shove the organs back into the patient's abdomen. No one knew why the anesthesia had failed. Carlos told Rebecca to quickly find some rope to tie the patient to the operating table. Unexpectedly, that incident caused a blade to fall out from the patient's abdomen. It turned out that this was the reason for his continuous bleeding. Rebecca was shaken and couldn't help but bend over to retch. Carlos scolded her to be more professional. He focused on finishing the surgery. After the suturing was completed and the patient stabilized, Carlos couldn't help but complain. In his 25 years of practice, He had never encountered anything so strange. Samu had read about cases of anesthetic somnambulism, but there was no scientific basis for such claims. Carlos questioned Rebecca about why she screamed earlier. What exactly did she see? Rebecca had to admit that she saw a nurse standing on the operating table. And didn't you hear the strange sounds? Carlos joked, "Are we haunted now?"
Y dada la falta de experiencia que tiene usted, tendrá que asumir la culpa de lo que aquí pasó.
Samu merely gave Rebecca's shoulder a symbolic squeeze. Clearly, he didn't want to take responsibility for the incident either. Rebecca returned to the changing room. She knelt in front of the photos of her guardian and parents to pray. Unexpectedly, the cabinet doors nearby swung open one after another. Rebecca quickly took out a razor blade and forced herself to stay awake through self-harm. The two cabinet doors quietly closed again, as if nothing had happened at all. On the other side, the front desk nurse finally couldn't resist and fell asleep, so she didn't hear the sound of pounding footsteps. As soon as she finished speaking, the little nurse's head was struck. She was knocked to the ground completely. She covered her face, got up and looked around, but didn't find anyone who had hit her. Only the red handprint on her face proved that it wasn't a dream. The little nurse thought someone was deliberately playing a prank on her. However, when she turned her head, she bumped into the ghostly nurse's face. The next morning, Rebecca was stopped while on her way to work. Her supervisor discovered that the copies of her birth certificate and nursing school identification submitted on her hiring day were missing, so she asked Rebecca to resubmit them. In fact, on her first night of work, Rebecca had sneaked into the file room and stolen her own documents. Nana heard their conversation at the stairwell. Rebecca was completely oblivious to this. As she approached the front desk, she saw Dr. Samu not far away. Lucy, passing by, noticed her infatuated gaze. Samu walked over, wrapped his arms around Rebecca, and comforted her kindly, telling her not to be upset. "Nurses often make small mistakes," he said. "The management won't punish you." He leaned in closer, starting to flirt openly. Rebecca caught sight of Lucy outside. Rebecca crawled over to pick up the photo. The nurses in the picture were all wearing black capes. It seemed that the ghostly nurse had worked in this building before. Rebecca asked the head nurse if she could set up an altar for these predecessors. The head nurse naturally wouldn't refuse. The next day, Rebecca set up a small altar right in front of the photo wall. The head nurse helped Rebecca, who was kneeling on the ground, to her feet. She told her not to be too fixated on this. "You'll see more strange things in the future. There are more suffering souls than just one." It seemed that the head nurse was aware of the existence of ghosts. She had worked here for 22 years. The head nurse felt that Rebecca was different from the other applicants. She would surely be able to complete the entire probation period. Rebecca, burdened with worries, went upstairs but was pulled back by Nana. Nana explained that it was thanks to Rebecca's father recommending her that she had the chance to become a nurse. "In fact, a few days ago, after running into you, I talked to an old colleague. She said you had mental health issues in the past. What was going on?" Rebecca claimed that she was depressed due to excessive grief over her father's death, and she begged her to keep it a secret.
También te quería decir algo. Además de haberme ayudado, tu papá abusó de mí.
Nana had been forced to have relations with Rebecca's father from the age of 16 to 23. There was a full 20-year age difference between them. This was undoubtedly a crime. Nana had never told anyone about this. Now, she had mustered the courage to bring it up, because she was worried that Rebecca might have a similar experience. Rebecca looked utterly dazed after hearing this. She couldn't help but remember Paula's warning, "Don't get involved with the staff." Rebecca began to intentionally avoid Samu, but he kept pursuing her relentlessly. She had to make it clear. Establishing special relationships with colleagues during work hours violated hospital policy, but Samu persistently asked, "What about meeting outside of work?" Rebecca immediately refused. She quickly entered the changing room. In her locker was a name tag. It read Dr. Ricardo Samudio. It seemed to belong to Rebecca's father. The persistent Samu chased into the changing room. He didn't care whether Rebecca was changing clothes or not. At this moment, he finally showed his true colors. Rebecca fought back and punched him. Unexpectedly, Samu punched her in the stomach. Then he left with a harsh remark. Furious, Rebecca smashed the statue. At this moment, the surrounding lockers suddenly swung open, and then closed simultaneously. Rebecca picked up the name tag, preparing to put it back in the locker. Unexpectedly, the ghostly nurse leaned out from inside. She was holding a scalpel in her hand. Rebecca hurriedly grabbed the name tag and recited a prayer. Then she tore her stockings to cut her wound. The intense pain made her head feel swollen. The ghostly nurse slowly retreated back into the locker. In the afternoon, a car accident patient named Vane was admitted. Although her internal organs were unharmed, She needed to stay for observation for about 20 days. Vane seemed to have a good impression of Samu, even wrapped like a mummy. She didn't forget to joke with the doctor. In the evening, Samu asked Rebecca for the keys, saying he was planning to stay and care for the patient. Rebecca wanted to stop him, but Samu threatened to use his authority to kick Rebecca out of the hospital. Then he entered the intensive care unit. Samu opened the locked cabinet. He found some medication inside and injected it into Vane. The girl immediately woke up from her slumber. Rebecca peeked through the curtain. She discovered that Samu was behaving inappropriately with the female patient. Just then, Rebecca heard someone calling her name. Following the sound, she went to the changing room and reopened the locker. To her shock, she found a piece of stitched human skin inside. It was slowly pulsating with each breath. Rebecca quickly shut the locker. Unexpectedly, the eerie footsteps sounded again. The ghostly nurse appeared once more. She suddenly closed the changing room door and came up behind Rebecca. The ghostly nurse slowly removed the covering from her face and revealed a horrifying lower half of her face. She kept advancing towards Rebecca, questioning, "Do you know what I've done?"
Hey, tranquila.
Rebecca ran out of the changing room, wanting to check on the situation in the intensive care unit. However, a small cart suddenly rolled over. It had a scalpel placed on top of it. Rebecca quickly called out to Dr. Samu. He sleepily walked out of the duty room and asked Rebecca what she was yelling about. Rebecca explained that it seems someone had broken into the intensive care unit. She was about to signal Samu to look at the tool cart, only to find that the scalpel was missing. Samu saw that a tool cart had inexplicably appeared in the hallway. He immediately unlocked it and went in to search each room. As Rebecca passed by the old man's room, he pointed to the room next door. Rebecca was about to go check it out. Then she saw the shadow of the ghostly nurse projected on the bed curtain. In the next second, the alarm went off. Samu came over and pulled back the bed curtain. He found Vane holding a scalpel, mutilating her own face. Soon after, the investigators sealed off the room where the incident occurred. No one could enter or exit freely until the military police arrived. Even staff members had to log their entries and exits. They also left a junior officer to supervise. Before long, it was Rebecca's last day of internship. The head nurse was joking around. "If by tomorrow morning you haven't killed anyone, you'll become a permanent employee." Just as she finished speaking, a supervisor came over to inform the head nurse. A reporter had interviewed the family of the self-harming patient. An article exposing scandals in our hospital was written. Also, the temporary front desk worker recently gave an interview, claiming that the hospital was haunted. In short, those temporary nurses refused to come in. Rebecca, Paula, and the others had to work overtime. Otherwise, the patients would have to be transferred to another hospital. Fortunately, the 3 night shift nurses were willing to work overtime. The supervisor also promised generous bonuses as compensation and reminded Rebecca not to forget to resubmit her identification documents. Rebecca changed into her uniform and worked diligently, but Nana kept hovering around. She secretly investigated Rebecca's background, learning that Rebecca had once stayed at the La Castaneda Psychiatric Hospital. If the police found out, they would definitely suspect Rebecca of harming patients. Meanwhile, the investigator was looking for Samu to ask questions. He wanted to see Vane's blood test results. After all, the pain of self-harm with a scalpel wasn't something an ordinary person can endure. The investigator wanted to know if Vane was conscious at the time. Samu was always cautious in his work. He had already altered the blood analysis report from that night, and also told the investigator to question Rebecca, who was in charge of the intensive care unit. The head nurse knew that the blood analysis requested by the detective didn't match the recorded results. After inventorying supplies, she also found that some medications were missing from the cabinet. The head nurse didn't know that Samu had secretly taken them. She thought the intensive care unit had been robbed again. Rebecca remembered what happened last night, but didn't tell the head nurse about Samu's misconduct. She only said that she had been assigned to the general ward last night, and was unaware of the situation in the intensive care unit. The head nurse helplessly said, "You'd better prepare yourself mentally. Every time something happens, it's the female nurses who suffer." At this moment, the detective walked out of the office to call Rebecca, but she said, "I still need to do my rounds," and hurriedly left.
¿Quieres que la obligue a venir para que la interrogamos?
Primero hay que investigar más, corralar.
During her afternoon shift, Rebecca discovered that Lucy was also having an inappropriate relationship with a patient, but she showed no fear at all. Soon after, a maintenance worker came to install cameras. Due to a series of incidents at the hospital, they planned to install surveillance in the hallway. The head nurse noticed that Rebecca looked pale, so she let her take a break in the duty room. Samu sneaked in while Rebecca was asleep. He brought a bottle of medicine he had stolen from the intensive care unit. Rebecca was quickly awakened by Samu's noise. She wanted to escape from his clutches, but Samu said, "If you dare to resist, I'll tell everyone that you drugged the patients. After all, I'm the doctor and you're just a nurse." It's easy to guess whose word everyone will believe. As she struggled, Rebecca unconsciously begged for her father's help. From this subconscious reaction, it was likely that she had experienced a similar fate as Nana. At this moment, a ghostly nurse's humming echoed in their ears. Then there was a banging sound at the duty room door. Samu thought it was the head nurse knocking, and hurriedly stopped what he was doing. He frantically tidied up the medicine. After adjusting his clothes, he opened the door, but there was no sign of the head nurse in the hallway. Rebecca seized the opportunity to escape from the duty room, and returned to the changing room to harm herself again. It seemed that only through this method could she maintain her sanity. Rebecca reached into the depths of the locker, touching the piece of human skin. She pulled apart the stitches on it. Tentatively, she crawled into the locker. Unexpectedly, she fell into a dilapidated basement. On the table lay newspapers from a few years ago. They mentioned that the hospital had gone through a plague. Many medical staff had hidden in the basement. Rebecca stuffed the newspaper into her pocket. The humming sound echoed in her ears again. A nurse was ironing clothes in the corner. From the information on the newspaper, this nurse should be named Laurie. Rebecca asked her if there was anything left unfinished. "I can help you complete it, so you can rest in peace." But Laurie suddenly removed the cloth covering her face, picked up the hot iron and pressed it against her own face. She approached Rebecca step by step, striking her down with the iron. Rebecca was pinned to the ground by Nurse Laurie, the red-hot iron pressed against her face. Meanwhile, the police officer on duty heard the singing. He got up to check his surroundings, and found that it was Rebecca walking down the hallway. They both saw a tool cart slowly glide to the entrance of the intensive care unit. Rebecca took the keys from the police officer, and noticed that they were stained with blood. They opened the door and saw a bloody scalpel on the tool cart. Rebecca blocked the door with the cart to prevent it from locking. Then she approached the dimly lit patient room. To her shock, the ghostly nurse had tied Lucy in the center of the room. She was holding a pair of surgical scissors in her hand. This time, the police officer also saw the ghostly nurse. He drew his gun and threatened her to drop the scissors, but the ghostly nurse vanished in the blink of an eye. The officer cautiously approached to check. He accidentally stepped on a pool of blood and slipped. His gun flew out of his hand. In the next second, the ghostly nurse rushed over and stabbed the officer in the eye with the scissors. He struggled for a moment before losing his breath. The ghostly nurse pulled out the scissors and continued to torment Lucy. As the alarm in the intensive care unit went off, Carlos hurried over to check it out. Carlos fell to the ground and died on the spot. Rebecca ran to the front desk to call the police, but the phone line had been cut by the ghostly nurse. Immediately, Rebecca found herself trapped in the intensive care unit. She ran back to the police officer to look for the keys. Just then, she bumped into her supervisor coming over. He was stunned to see Carlos's body. Before he could react, he heard a demonic whisper. The ghostly nurse stabbed a cranial drill into his mouth. Rebecca hurriedly opened the door and swung the scalpel at the nurse. The ghostly nurse roared in rage. Rebecca was so frightened that she fell to the ground. She accidentally stabbed the scalpel into her supervisor's forehead. Then the tool cart slid over again. It held new murder weapons on top. This time, the ghostly nurse's target was Dr. Samu. She tightened the wire in her hand and quickly charged at Samu. Then she cut his head in half. When dawn broke, the police arrived at the scene. Rebecca told the head nurse that it was all Laurie's doing. The nurse who died of the plague killed everyone. The head nurse told Rebecca to rest in place first. Then she and the officer opened the surveillance footage, but the contents inside were chilling. The footage showed Rebecca stealing the police keys. She drugged Lucy and entered the intensive care unit. Then she pushed the tool cart to the door. Using the surgical tools on it, she killed everyone, and the newspaper brought from the basement actually reported that Rebecca was hospitalized for schizophrenia due to being victimized by her biological father. It turned out that all the recent accidents in the hospital were caused by her alone. The investigator tried to approach and arrest her, but he was stabbed to death by the furious Rebecca with a scalpel. The so-called ghost nurse Laurie was merely a split personality of Rebecca. She helped Rebecca punish unjust supervisors and terrible colleagues. No wonder the locker doors would close, and the ghostly nurse would vanish every time Rebecca self-harmed. It seemed that only pain could temporarily bring her mind back to clarity. The film ended here. I thought it was a Chinese horror film, but didn't expect that the last line about insanity would clarify the entire plot. Of course, aside from this, the atmosphere, the rendering, and the lead actress's performance were all superb and impeccable. Moreover, it felt more like a film about the rights of female nurses than a horror movie. The various workplace bullying Rebecca faced in the hospital were very close to reality. If they could flesh out the background of the ghost nurse in the hospital, and not use schizophrenia as the final outcome, the viewing experience would definitely be greatly enhanced.